We're back to Gary Paulson's book, Tucket's Gold. This is the fourth book in a 5-book series. I'm reading outside. Sometimes you hear the birds. And there's a squirrel over there in a birdhouse, chewing the top of the birdhouse. Hopefully the planes won't come over and quieten everything down. So here we go. Chapter 3. They walked along the stream the rest of the day, and though they saw plenty of tracks, deer and rabbit and coyote and some raccoon, they made too much noise for the game to hold position for a shot. Francis thought of going ahead to hunt, but he hated the idea of leaving the children alone so soon after their brush with the comancheros. He had despaired of getting any food, but just before dark, when he walked around a curve in the stream, there was a young spike buck standing angled away with its head down, drinking water. Francis raised and fired without thinking. So fast, Lottie yelled and dropped to the ground. She thought somebody was shooting at them. For a second, he thought he'd missed. The deer made an amazing leap to the side, clearing the edge of the stream bed and landing above them a good 8 feet up and 15 over. But Francis was sure he'd held true, and that the ball had gone into the back of the ribs and out the front through the heart. When he climbed up the side of the stream, the buck was lying there on its side, dead. Francis paused, thinking fate and the spirits and the deer. Why didn't he thank God? Anyways, thinking fate and the spirits and the deer, his stomach growling all the while, and then handed the knife from his possibles kit to Lottie. Start gutting it and we'll skin it. We'll stay here a day or two and make some moccasins with the green hide. I'm going to look around and make sure we're alone. At one time, Lottie would have objected to getting stuck with the work, but she was too hungry. Billy looked like he was going to start chewing on one of the deer's feet any second. It was not a time to be squeamish. Francis reloaded, put a cap in the nipple, and studied the surrounding country. He had 2 worries. One, that somebody might have heard the shot. The Lancaster had a small bore, 40 caliber, and made a fearsomely high, sharp crack when it went off. Still, the sound probably wouldn't carry more than a mile or two. He had fired in the confines of the stream bed, but he wanted to make sure it was a safe mile or two. The second worry was about a fire. They could eat the raw meat. Francis had done so on occasion, and he was sure Lottie and Billy would be able to stomach it, but he longed for a full hot meal. He also needed to melt some grease off the deer to replenish his supply for shooting and cleaning and to work into their feet and moccasin leather. He needed a day down, and the children needed at least a day of rest, maybe more. He had to be able to make a fire and not have to attract any attention. The country had changed dramatically as they'd moved up the stream bed. It had gone from flat desert prairie to a rolling terrain with outcroppings of rock. Francis climbed one of these outcroppings and sat on the top. It was about 3 hours from dark, and the late light cast long shadows from the hills and the rocks. He sat quietly and let his mind go blank, let his eyes study. There, a bird wheeling a hawk, and there, a deer a mile and more away. To the right, half a mile on, a family groping of antelope, 3 of them, and over there another hawk diving on something, maybe a mouse, and 4 crows wheeling in a warm draft of air, climbing and tumbling. 2 jackrabbits running from 1 coyote a half mile to the left. All normal things, all seen and dismissed. Francis was looking for the other thing, the thing that didn't match the surrounding country. A bit of sharp line, a movement, a curve that didn't follow nature. He swiveled and studied for a full half hour and did not see or hear anything out of place. He gave it another half hour, not moving except to turn carefully, cradling the rifle across his arm. But there was truly nothing out of the ordinary to see or hear or smell or feel. At last he was satisfied, and he stood slowly, his legs stiff, moving down the hill and back to where Lottie and Billy were working. The deer was gutted and the rear partially skinned. It looked like Billy had more blood on him than was in the deer. He looked like a wild animal. Lottie, who had been doing the real work, had only a spot of blood on her cheeks and some on her hands, but she smiled through the cloud of flies. It was hard to believe how many there could be in such a short time in an otherwise empty prairie, and motioned to a stack of wood. I had Billy bring in wood. I wasn't sure you'd want a fire, but if you did, it would be hard to find in the dark, and we might fetch a snake here where we to grope around without light. I collect the time. One of my neighbors, I think it was that one named Nancy, she fetched a snake in a woodpile. Then she was reaching for some firewood in the dark, and that was the last time she brought in wood after dark. Francis waited. Nothing more came. I know I'm going to be sorry for this, he thought. I know I shouldn't do this. I know it's just the worst thing in the whole world to do. What happened to the snake? She had it by the tail and took it and whopped it against the side of a chopping block and killed it. And then she said to the snake, she said, if you want to act like wood, you could be Jingo be wood. And she shoved it in the stove. It was stiff as a poker because she whopped it kind of hard and it burned up for heat. A deep breath. Of course, that was before she up and took with the hands and could tell about things before they come to be. I remember the time. Francis let her go. He was used to the talk. As a matter of fact, he was getting fond of it and recognized that it was not because she liked to talk so much as because she saw things, saw everything there was to see, and was very, very smart. She missed nothing, and when there was something to be done, gunning a deer, gathering wood, which she hadn't told her to do, but she'd taken care of just on the off chance that he would want a fire, she jumped in and did it. She finished the story about Nancy while she skinned the deer. Billy helped, and Francis took over when the carcass had to be flopped to get the skin free. Get some sharp sticks to cook on, he said, green so they won't burn. When the skin was completely off the carcass, he draped it over a bush and cut some meat into strips, meat from the back haunches and the tenderloin down the back. These he laid on top of the ribs to keep them out of the dirt. Then he set about making a fire. He had no flint or striker, but he did have a rifle and powder. He cut slivers of wood from the dry underside of a wet log and found some dead grass already drying in the hot sun after the rain. He arranged the shredded grass and slivers of wood in a small hollow and sprinkled a bit of powder onto a tiny pocket beneath the grass, leaving a thin trail, some coming back on top of a small flat rock. At the end of the powder trail, he put a percussion cap, picked up another stone, and struck the cap. Boom, just like that. It went off with a sharp snapping sound. It lit the powder, whose trail acted as a short fuse that set off the bit beneath the grass. Within 3 seconds, he had a small fire growing. More wood, he called, and Lottie handed him small pieces until they had a healthy blaze. Now the meat. He took a strip of venison, put it on one of the green sticks, and held it over the flame so close that the bottom end started to burn. Lottie and Billy did the same, and when the meat was hot, well before it was fully cooked, Billy could stand it no longer and ate his piece. He immediately started cooking another, by which time Francis and Lottie had eaten theirs and started no more. They sat that way into the night, eating and cooking, grease in their hair and faces until a large part of the deer was gone, and they were so full they couldn't move. Francis blinked, a bit of smoke in his eyes, and he was so bone-tired that the blink was enough. His belly was full, and the fire was warm in his face, and his eyes didn't really open after the blink. He rolled onto his side, still facing the fire, saw the children do the same, was instantly, profoundly asleep. Oh boy. He slept, this is chapter 4, he slept hard until the sun came creeping into the stream bed and warmed his face. His eyes opened, then he saw the 2 children lying asleep on the other side of the fire pit. He rose and stood. Every muscle in his body seemed to ache and stretch. Amazing what a difference a full belly and a drink of water could make. He picked up his rifle and moved off a bit, climbed the side of the arroyo, and swept the horizon. The sleep had been wrong. In this country, to not keep an open eye, but just to drop off by the fire was insane. But he had been so tired he couldn't have stayed awake if he'd been lying in broken grass. Nothing. A clear blue morning sky, not even a line of clouds, no dust, no horsemen, nothing. It was as if Francis thought they were completely alone on the planet. We ate most of the deer, Lottie said in the back of him, startling him. Should we get the fire going again and cook the rest? Small, Francis said. A small dry fire. No smoke. We don't want to attract company. Use dry wood and keep it little. There was some hot coals still there to keep it going. I know. You don't have to be telling me everything, Francis. I know some things. I know lots of things. There was a man, he came through one time back on the farm and had a list of questions to see could a person know things, and I answered most of them, although some of the questions were dumb. One was about horses and fish and dogs. Francis just let her ramble and make a fire while he set to work on the hide. Billy was still asleep. They had skinned the deer close so there wasn't any flesh or fat adhering to the hide to scrape off, and he stretched the skin to dry in the sun. It would shrink, he knew, but he cut strips from the edge to use for thongs and lacing, and he stretched the skin to keep it flat while it dried. How long until we can make moccasins? Lottie asked. It should dry enough today if it doesn't cloud up and rain. We can rig something up tomorrow. They'll be they'll be made of rawhide, but they'll help a bit. Good, my poor feet. Lottie held up one off the ground, standing on one foot and tipping the other sole up behind her. Francis could see it was torn and blistering. His were the same, and he looked down at Billy, still asleep, and saw the boys were the worst off. Well, Francis thought, it is a good place to rest. We still have some meat. He marveled that could have eaten most of the deer, but he'd seen Indians do the same, and after all, they had not eaten properly for days. There's water, he thought, and wood, and we're alone. We'll stay here 2 days. Fish me out the deer guts. What? Lottie said. The tube guts from the deer, the intestines. Pull them out of the gut pile. Is this some kind of joke, Francis? Because if it is, never mind. I'll do it myself. Francis went to the pile of guts where they had left them. A cloud of flies came up, but he took a stick and fished out the intestines. He'd seen Indian women clean them out and hang them to dry with a rock for weight so they could become like string for sewing. But they were too far gone and torn apart when he tried to stretch a piece of them. He threw them back. The stomach, lungs, heart, and liver were all still there, and he knew it was a waste not to eat them. Indians would have eaten them first and saved the meat for later. He'd seen them, and Grimes, too, eat buffalo guts and liver raw out of an animal almost before it was dead, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, though it was always wrong to waste part of a kill. The next day, Francis found that making moccasins was more difficult than he'd thought. He had repaired them himself when they had worn out, but he'd never had made a pair from scratch. The hide had been stretched and dried for only one day in the hot afternoon sun. Unfortunately, the hair was still on it. Francis used his knife to cut the hair shorter, but they didn't have the week it took to throw the hide in the creek and let the hair slip out of the skin. For that matter, Francis thought, looking at the stream bed, which had further dried up since the rain, we don't have a creek either. He made the children stand on the hide's skin side and stretched outlines of their feet. He added half an inch around the sides and cut the sole pieces, and he did the same for himself, and then set all the pieces on the ground side by side and looked at them. Well, he said, they need walls, Billy said. They ain't going to work without they have walls. You mean sides, Lottie said, and he knows that, don't you, Francis? You know how to do that, don't you? Francis nodded. Sure. Of course he didn't, but if he admitted it to Lottie, he'd never get another word in. He studied the hide again, wishing he'd spent more time watching the women work and make things when he was a Pawnee captive. Billy was right. The soles needed walls. Francis cut long strips of hide into 2 inches wide, cut narrow laces from the remaining hide, and after boring holes with his knife, laced the strips around the soles so they stood upright. Then he cut toe pieces, and laced them to the tops of the walls until he had some version of moccasins. They look alive, Billy said. Like they'll eat our feet. Francis smiled. They did look odd. He hadn't gotten all the hair off, and even the laces were fuzzy. The end result was comical. Hair-covered, fluffy, odd ends sticking out all over the place. They'll break in soon, Francis said. Let's get walking. I don't like staying here. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Comancheros had ridden past them, well to the south, but past them just the same, and would come back for them somehow. When Francis was finished, they'd been in camp just over 2 days, and that time the 3 of them had eaten most of the good meat of the deer, except for some strips they'd dried in the sun. Francis gave the strips to Lottie and Billy to carry, shuffled his feet deep into the green hide moccasins, and set off. Which way are we going? Lottie held back. Do we have a plan? Northwest. It's the only way to go. In truth, they had no choice. Somewhere to the west of them lay a great desert. He had heard people talk of it, and if he took children there, they would certainly die of thirst. East of them lay a whole area ravaged by the war between Mexico and the United States, an area where bandits ruled the land. And south of them, well, that was the way to the Comancheros, and he had no illusions about their fate if they went that way. If they went far enough north, they would meet up with the Oregon Trail and maybe get on with a wagon train and head west, and he could find his family, and it was always there. The dream, the hope. But the truth was, he could barely remember them. He stopped walking as the thought struck him. He felt close to these 2 children, felt that Lottie and Billy were more of a family to him than the one he'd lost when he was taken prisoner. Lottie and Billy had been trudging with their heads down and ran into Francis. Why, we stopped. Lottie pulled at her moccasins, which were loose and slapped on her feet. What are you thinking about? Francis looked at them and smiled. Families, he said. I was thinking about families. Then he settled his possibles bag, held his loaded rifle loosely and easily in his right hand, the hammer already on half cock, and started southwest in the easy shuffle he'd learned from the Indians. It was the only way to go. Wow, that was chapter 3 and 4. Be back with more tomorrow. Bye.